The shocking truth about Lot's daughters. Bible secrets revealed. In the ancient pages of the Bible, there's a controversial and thought-provoking story, the tale of Lot and his daughters. This isn't just a simple story about survival or morality, but a profound lesson about human nature, choices in extreme situations, and how God works through life's most complex scenarios. Let's delve into this story together, explore its lesser-known corners, and examine it in the light of modern ethics and theology. We'll ask tough questions, face uncomfortable situations, and perhaps learn something about ourselves in the process. Part 1. Historical and Cultural Context. To fully understand this story, we need to place it in the historical and cultural context of that era. We're talking about a period roughly 4,000 years ago in the land called Canaan, which is now the Middle East. This was a world very different from the one we live in today. Small city-states dominated the political landscape, each with its own deity and customs. Sodom and Gomorrah, the two cities Lot had chosen as his home, were famous for their wealth and their sin. But what does sin mean here? In ancient Jewish culture, sin was often understood as a violation of God's law, especially acts related to inappropriate sexual behavior and social injustice. Imagine Sodom as the Las Vegas of ancient times, a place of debauchery and luxury where normal moral standards seem to no longer exist. This is where Lot, Abraham's nephew, chose to settle. But why did Lot choose to live in such a place? The Bible gives us a hint. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. Genesis 13:10-11. Lot was attracted by the fertility and wealth of the land. But was that a wise decision? We'll soon see the consequences of this choice. Part 2. Lot in Sodom, a righteous man in a sinful city? The Bible describes Lot as a righteous man. But how does a righteous man choose to live amidst depravity? This is a question that has puzzled Bible scholars for centuries. Perhaps Lot thought he could maintain his integrity while still enjoying Sodom's wealth. Or maybe he hoped to positively influence the city. But whatever the reason, we see that Lot's decision put him and his family in a dangerous situation. The Apostle Peter later wrote about Lot. He rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man, living among them day after day, was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. 2 Peter 2:7-8. This shows that Lot struggled with his surroundings. He wasn't comfortable with Sodom's sin, but for some reason he stayed. The question for us is, how can we live in the world without being influenced by the world? How can we be in the world, but not of the world, as Jesus taught? Part 3. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Eventually, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah reached a point where God decided to destroy them. But before doing so, God sent two angels to warn and rescue Lot and his family. The passage describing this is one of the most controversial in the Bible. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. Genesis 19:1. What happens next is a series of shocking events. The men of Sodom demand that Lot hand over his guests so they can know them, a euphemism for sexual acts. Lot, in an effort to protect his guests, offers his daughters to the crowd instead. This action of Lot's has caused much debate. How could a man considered righteous propose such a terrible thing? Is this the result of living too long in a depraved environment? Or is it an extreme example of ancient hospitality laws where protecting guests was valued above even family life? Whatever the reason, this action shows the profound influence of environment on human morality. It raises the question, can we maintain our integrity in an environment completely opposed to our values. Part 4. The Escape and Tragedy. The angels eventually intervene, saving Lot and his family from the angry mob. They warn Lot that God is about to destroy the city and that he must flee immediately. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." Genesis 19:15. But even when faced with imminent destruction, Lot hesitates. Why? Was it because he had become too attached to life in Sodom? Or because he couldn't believe God would actually destroy an entire city? Eventually, the angels have to take Lot and his family by the hand and pull them out of the city. This is a powerful image of God's grace. Even when we hesitate, He pulls us out of danger. But tragedy strikes on the escape route. Lot's wife, despite the warning not to look back, does so and turns into a pillar of salt. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19:26. This is one of the most striking images in the Bible. But why did she look back? Was it nostalgia, curiosity, or was it a final act of disobedience? Perhaps this action symbolizes the unwillingness to let go of the old life, a warning to us about the danger of clinging to the past when God is leading us to a new future. Part 5. In the Cave. The Controversial Decision. After escaping from Sodom, Lot and his 2 daughters find refuge in a cave in the mountains. They are lonely, afraid, and believe they are the last survivors on earth. It's in this context that we come to the most controversial part of the story. Lot's daughters, believing they are the last people on earth, decide to have children with their father to preserve the human race. "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." Genesis 19:31-32. This is a shocking and difficult passage for many to understand. How could an act considered a serious sin like incest occur in the Bible? And why would God allow this to happen? To understand this action, we need to consider the cultural and psychological context of the characters. In ancient society, maintaining lineage was considered extremely important. Having no children meant that a person's name and legacy would be erased. For Lot's daughters, this may have been seen as a sacred responsibility. Moreover, we need to consider their psychological state. They had just witnessed the destruction of their entire known world. They had lost their mother, their home, and believed they were the last survivors. In such an extreme state of fear and isolation, people can make decisions they would never consider under normal circumstances. However, this doesn't mean their action was justified. The Bible never praises or endorses this behavior. Instead, it's presented as a historical event, leaving it to the reader to judge. Part 6. Long-term consequences. The actions of Lot's daughters had long-lasting consequences. Each bore a son, Moab and Ben-Ami, ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. Genesis 19:37-38. The Moabites and Ammonites became separate nations, often in conflict with Israel. Throughout the Old Testament, we see many wars and conflicts between Israel and these 2 nations. For example, in the book of Judges, we read about Eglon, king of Moab, who oppressed Israel for 18 years, Judges 3:14. In the book of Kings, we see many conflicts between Israel and Moab, 2 Kings 3. However, the story doesn't end there. Despite originating from an act considered sinful, God still used these lineages in His plan. A notable example is Ruth, a Moabite woman, who became an ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus. Boaz, the father of Obed, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. Ruth 4:21-22. This shows God's amazing ability to turn bad into good and reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of His grace. Part 7. Lessons learned. So, what can we learn from this complex story? There are many lessons to be drawn. The power of environment. Lot's story shows how environment can strongly influence our morals and decisions. Lot started as a righteous man, but prolonged exposure to Sodom's sin affected his judgment. Lesson. We need to be careful about the influences we allow in our lives. As the Bible says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. 1 Corinthians 15:33. The danger of isolation. Lot's daughters made an extreme decision because they believed they were alone in the world. Isolation can lead to distorted thoughts and actions. Lesson. This reminds us of the importance of community and healthy relationships. We need others for reality checks and emotional support. Consequences of decisions. The actions of Lot's daughters had consequences lasting for generations. This reminds us that our decisions can affect many others, even those not yet born. Lesson. We need to carefully consider before making decisions, especially in stressful or difficult situations. God's grace. Despite the story being full of morally questionable actions, God still uses it in His larger plan. This shows God's boundless grace and mercy. Lesson. No one is beyond the reach of God's grace. He can use even the worst situations to bring about good. Importance of faith. Lot and his daughters acted based on fear and lack of faith. They didn't believe God could provide them a future outside of Sodom or the cave. Lesson. We are called to live by faith, not by fear. As the Bible says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." 2 Timothy 1:7. Part 8. Application to modern life. Although this story happened thousands of years ago, it still has many points relevant to our modern lives. Choosing our environment. Like Lot, we often face choices about where to live and work. Should we choose a high-paying job that requires moral compromise? Or should we prioritize a spiritually healthier environment? Facing disaster. In an age of climate change and global instability, we may find ourselves in crisis situations like Lot and his daughters. How can we maintain our morals and faith in such times? Influence of technology. In the digital age, we can easily become isolated in our own virtual caves, only interacting with like-minded people. How can we ensure we're not isolated and disconnected from the larger reality? Ethics in times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed many difficult ethical questions. For example, when medical resources are scarce, who should be prioritized for treatment? Such situations force us to face difficult ethical decisions, like the characters in our story. Long-term consequences of decisions. In the age of social media, a small decision, like posting a controversial post, can have long-lasting and far-reaching consequences. Lot's story reminds us of the importance of careful consideration before acting. Conclusion. The story of Lot and his daughters is one of the most controversial and difficult to understand in the Bible. It challenges us to think deeply about ethics, survival, and how God works in the most complex situations of human life. It reminds us that the Bible is not a simple book with clear black and white stories. Instead, it reflects the complexity of human life with all our flaws, mistakes, and hopes. Finally, this story invites us to look at our own lives. Are we making decisions based on fear or faith? Are we allowing our surrounding environment to influence our moral values? And most importantly, do we trust that even in the worst situations, God can bring about good? As we continue our journey, remember that no situation is too complex for God. He can use even our mistakes and failures to accomplish His purpose. And in every situation, We are called to trust in His guidance and grace. Carry these reflections into your daily life. You may never face an extreme situation like Lot and his daughters, but we all face difficult decisions and complex situations. In those moments, remember that we are not alone. We have our community. We have wisdom from lessons of the past, and above all, we have God's guidance and grace. The story of Lot and his daughters is not just a story about the distant past. It's a mirror reflecting human nature, a warning about the dangers of moral compromise, and a promise of God's unceasing grace. Let it challenge us, teach us, and above all, let it remind us that in every situation, we can always put our trust in God.